A calm evening enveloped the village. The sun hung low, painting the earth with a golden hue as villagers busied themselves with their final chores. Children's laughter mingled with the rustling of the wind, and the faint clinking of tools echoed across the square. It was the kind of evening that lulled everyone into a sense of safety and routine. The elders gathered near the largest baobab tree, their faces weathered yet serene, nodding occasionally as they shared quiet words of wisdom. Everything felt as it always did, familiar, steady, timeless. But as the sun kissed the horizon, a subtle shift crept into the air. The villagers began moving with a touch more urgency. A woman hurried her goats home. A man hastened to shut the gates of his small pen. The marketplace, bustling mere moments ago, was now nearly deserted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. The protagonist, lingering by the well, noticed it first. They tilted their head, as if listening for a sound not yet there. A faint tension seemed to ripple through the wind. It wasn't until the first low, mournful wail came that the feeling solidified. The crying rock had begun to sing again. The sound grew louder, rising in pitch and intensity as the sun dipped lower. It was no mere hum or whistle. It was a deep, haunting cry that resonated in the bones, a sorrowful, otherworldly wail that seemed to echo from the earth's core. The villagers froze, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and resignation. Some turned their heads away, unwilling to look toward the rock's direction. Others whispered hurried prayers, clutching tokens carved from wood or bone. The protagonist, however, could not look away. Their eyes darted toward the edge of the square where the elders stood. For the first time, they saw something rarely glimpsed, fear etched into the elders' features. They huddled together, their normally calm expressions replaced by concern and unease. One of them muttered, "It cannot happen again," while another gestured toward the younger villagers, whispering, "Keep them away." Fragments of their conversation reached the protagonist's ears. Words like disaster and hidden floated through the air. It was clear the elders knew more than they let on. The protagonists clenched their fists. For years they had heard the faint cries at sunset and witnessed the uneasy glances exchanged among the elders. Tonight the sound was different, louder, more insistent. Whatever secrets the elders kept, the crying rock's voice threatened to unearth them. Determined to uncover the truth, the protagonist stayed rooted in place, while the villagers retreated indoors and the elders withdrew to their quiet deliberations. The protagonist resolved to follow the threads of this mystery. They would find out why the crying rock wailed, why the elders feared it so, and what it meant for the village. As the sun vanished completely, leaving only the stars and the wailing echo, the protagonist's journey began. The elders gathered in their usual circle, their voices low and deliberate as they recounted the tale. Long ago, they said, an elder named Naya had vanished near the crying rock. She was known for her wisdom and her gift of foresight. On the eve of a great storm, she had ventured to the rock and never returned. Her disappearance left a deep scar on the village's memory. Over time, whispers of her spirit haunting the rock grew, feeding the belief that the rock's cries were her sorrow echoing through the years. The crying rock was unlike any other in the region. Its surface was rough and speckled, but faint carvings could be seen by those who dared to look closely. Carvings that resembled weary human faces, frozen in silent grief. At the base of the rock, a hollow formed a shallow basin. After every rainfall, water collected there, glistening like tears under the sun. Some villagers swore that on the nights when the rock wailed, the water would ripple as if disturbed by unseen hands. Growing up, the protagonist heard countless warnings. Their grandmother would hold them close at bedtime and whisper, "Never. Stay near the rock after dusk. The night it cries, something will come for you." These admonitions were often repeated by other elders, each adding their own chilling detail. The rock was said to curse anyone who lingered too long in its presence. As a child, the protagonist accepted these warnings without question. But as they grew older, their curiosity began to overshadow their fear. The younger villagers often shared their frustration in hushed conversations by the riverbank. They wondered why the elders refused to explain the rock's cries. Some dismissed the stories as superstitions, while others, like the protagonist and their closest friend, were eager to know the truth. The younger generation felt the weight of rules they didn't understand. Why couldn't they ask questions? Why couldn't they challenge the authority of the elders, who seemed to hold secrets they were unwilling to share? In this village, oral traditions and rituals held the community together. The elders, as keepers of the village's history, were deeply respected. Every decision, from planting seasons to dispute resolutions, passed through their council. Their authority was unchallenged, and their caution regarding the crying rock was accepted without question by most. Over the years, they had woven a narrative of protection around the rock. "It's not just a rock," one elder would say. "It's a reminder, a warning." The protagonist began to notice strange patterns. Goats grazing near the rock would suddenly stop, heads up and ears twitching before bolting away. Birds that perched on the rock seemed agitated, flying off after only a few moments. Even during the day, the rock stood apart, untouched and avoided. When the topic came up in conversation, the elders grew quiet. They exchanged knowing glances, their lips pressed into thin lines. If anyone mentioned approaching the rock, the conversation would abruptly shift to other matters. The silence around it was as telling as the stories themselves. Despite all the warnings and the tension that surrounded the crying rock, the protagonist could not let the mystery go. Each new observation, every story half told, strengthened their resolve. They began to seek out fragments of knowledge, an offhand remark from a reluctant elder, a scrap of an old chant murmured by the fire, a forgotten mark etched into an old tree near the rock. The more they learned, the more they needed to know. As the questions piled up, so too did their determination to find the answers, no matter the cost. The protagonist approached the elders one by one, their tone respectful but insistent. "What is the rock? Why does it cry?" The elders exchanged knowing glances, their expressions hardening. The eldest of them shook his head. "It is not for you to know," he muttered, his voice low and final. Frustrated but undeterred, the protagonist pressed on, only to meet the same stony refusal. Each unanswered question deepened their curiosity. One evening, just before dusk, the protagonist and their closest friend slipped away from the village square, venturing toward the crying rock. They tread lightly, their hearts pounding as the sun sank lower. The sound began faintly, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as they drew closer, it grew, swelling into a mournful wail that sent shivers down their spines. They froze, staring at the rock as its eerie cry filled the air. Near the base of the rock, the protagonist noticed unusual carvings. Faint lines formed intricate patterns, resembling faces or ancient runes. Nearby, a barely visible path wound into the woods. The friend pointed it out, whispering, "The elders said no paths lead from here." The protagonist crouched, tracing the markings with their fingertips, their thoughts racing. These symbols were unlike anything they had seen, hinting at a secret history. Back in the village, news of their approach to the crying rock spread quickly. Younger villagers whispered among themselves, emboldened by the protagonist's courage. "Maybe it's time we knew the truth," some said. Others, however, frowned at the disruption. "The elders have their reasons," a few muttered. Tensions grew as villagers began taking sides, those who supported uncovering the mystery and those who feared the consequences. At the next village gathering, tempers flared. "Why do you keep us in the dark?" a young farmer demanded. The elders raised their hands, imploring calm. "You don't understand what you're asking for," one elder warned. "The crying rock's voice is a sign of danger. You risk waking something that should remain silent." The protagonist stepped forward, their voice steady. "If we don't understand it, how can we ever stop fearing it?" Driven by the elders' evasions, the protagonist searched the old meeting hall. Tucked away in a dusty corner, they found an ancient manuscript, its cover worn and its pages delicate. As they read, the truth began to emerge. Generations ago, the village had made a bargain, an agreement that brought safety but came at a hidden cost. The manuscript's words were cryptic, but they spoke of a ritual, a promise, and a terrible consequence. The protagonist returned to the elders, the manuscript in hand. "Is this why the rock cries?" they asked, their voice firm. The elders' faces paled. One elder reached out as if to snatch the manuscript, but hesitated. Another whispered, "You shouldn't have seen that." The protagonist stood their ground. "We have a right to know. What happened? Why did you keep it from us?" The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their silence heavy with guilt. As the arguments raged, the crying rock's voice grew louder each evening. Its wails echoed across the fields, chilling the villagers to the bone. Shadows flickered at the edges of the forest, dancing in time with the sound. The elders huddled together, their fear obvious. The younger villagers, emboldened by the protagonist, demanded action. "If you won't tell us, we'll find out ourselves," one declared. The protagonist returned to the rock, this time with the manuscript in hand. They compared the carvings on the rock to the illustrations in the book. The shapes matched. Each marking on the rock mirrored a symbol in the text, a guide to a ritual long forgotten. The realization struck hard. The crying rock wasn't merely a cursed object. It was a warning, a memory, and a key to a truth the village had long buried. The protagonist stood before the gathered villagers, their face set with determination. The small group that had pledged to stand with them brought torches and tools, their expressions a mix of fear and resolve. The whispered doubts from earlier had given way to murmurs of quiet encouragement. As they waited for the sun to dip, the tension in the air was almost palpable. The first low wail began as the sky turned a fiery red. A few villagers flinched, some stepping back instinctively, but the protagonist held firm. The cry grew louder, more mournful, echoing across the fields. People turned towards the crying rock as if drawn by an unseen force. Their movements slowed. As they reached the edge of the square, the sound pulling them into its unsettling grip. An elder stepped forward, their hands raised, their voice trembling. "Do not continue," they called out. "You risk awakening what should remain buried." The other elders echoed the warning, their tone desperate. "You do not understand. This sound is a warning, a reminder. It is not meant to be silenced." The protagonists shook their head. "We can't keep running from the past," they replied. "We need to face it." The protagonist's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "All this time, we've let fear hold us back. We've let the cries haunt us because we were too afraid to know the truth." They turned toward the villagers. "This rock may cry, but we are the ones who choose whether to listen or to hide. Today, we choose to listen and to understand." The murmurs turned to nods, and a few villagers stepped forward in solidarity. As the last sliver of sun vanished, the crying rock's wail rose to a deafening peak. People covered their ears, some crying out, others standing frozen. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure what would happen next. For a moment, all was still. The rock groaned, a low rumble that sent tremors through the ground. A thin crack appeared on its surface, growing wider until it revealed a dark hollow. Inside, the faint glint of something metallic caught the torchlight. The protagonist stepped closer, their heart pounding, and carefully reached in to pull out a small, ornate relic. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they recognized it, an artifact thought lost, its appearance proof of an ancient pact. The protagonist studied the relic and the manuscript they had brought. The symbols matched perfectly. This was the missing piece, the link to the village's hidden history. Slowly, the story became clear. Generations ago, leaders had made a desperate decision, one that kept the village safe at the cost of a terrible betrayal. The cries of the rock had been a warning, a reminder of the promises broken and the guilt carried silently through the years. The realization spread through the villagers like wildfire. The curse wasn't from an external force. It was their own doing. The elders, protectors of this secret, had tried to keep the shame hidden, believing that silence was safer than truth. Now, with the evidence in plain sight, the weight of guilt was laid bare. Some villagers looked down in shame. Others glared at the elders, their trust shattered. The protagonist stood at the center of the gathering, the relic held tightly in their hands. "We can't undo what was done," they said, their voice steady. "But we can choose what we do now. Do we let this guilt divide us further? Or do we face it together, learn from it, and begin to heal?" The villagers were silent, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. The choice was clear, but it was not easy. The truth had emerged, and what happened next would shape their village's future. The villagers stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the elder who had just revealed the hidden pact. A few shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with anger and betrayal. The weight of the truth bore down on them all. The once respected elders now appeared small and uncertain. Some villagers turned away, crossing their arms as if to shield themselves from the implications. Others, visibly shaken, demanded more answers. "Why would you keep this from us?" someone asked. The elder faltered, their voice trembling. "We thought it was for the best, to protect you from the burden we carried." The protagonist stepped forward, their tone steady but firm. "What's done is done," they began. "But we can't let the past continue to divide us. It's time we face it together." They scanned the crowd, locking eyes with as many villagers as they could. "This is our story, every one of us. The elders' silence was wrong, but so is letting our fear and anger keep us apart. We must acknowledge the truth if we ever hope to heal." Slowly, a few villagers nodded. The murmurs quieted as the weight of the words began to sink in. A cleansing ceremony. As the sun dipped low, the villagers gathered around the crying rock. This time, they held not only torches, but also garlands, water basins, and symbolic items, handed down through generations. A hush fell over the crowd as an elder, their voice clear but humble, began the ritual. They poured water over the rock's surface, allowing it to run through the hollow and pool at the base. The village women, once afraid to approach, placed flowers around the base. Men and children touched the rock with steady hands, no longer recoiling. The once dreaded sound did not return. Instead, the air seemed lighter, filled with the murmured prayers and songs of a community seeking peace. After the ceremony, villagers who had avoided one another for years began to talk. Small groups formed, discussing not only the truth they had learned, but also their own fears and regrets. The protagonist noticed old rivals sharing quiet words, once stern elders standing beside younger villagers, their hands resting on their shoulders. "You had the courage to ask questions," an elder admitted to the protagonist. "Perhaps if we had shown the same courage long ago." The protagonist nodded, acknowledging the elder's change of heart. "It's not too late to start," they replied. Days turned to weeks, and the village slowly transformed. Meetings became more open, decisions more inclusive. The youth, once dismissed, now had a voice, and the elders listened. The crying rock, now cleansed, stood as a silent witness to their progress. The village's daily life resumed, but with an undercurrent of newfound unity. Traditions were honored, but not at the cost of transparency. The story of the crying rock was no longer whispered in fear. It was told openly, a lesson passed from one generation to the next. The crying rock no longer symbolized dread or secrecy. Instead, it became a monument to the village's resilience. Visitors would run their hands over its surface, and elders would recount the tale, not as a warning but as a reminder of the strength found in honesty and unity. The once haunting wail was replaced by the harmonious sound of voices, singing and laughing together. The village had moved beyond its shadowed past, turning its pain into a foundation for a brighter future. The protagonist sat at the edge of the field, staring at the horizon as the sun cast its final golden light. They thought of the elders' burden, the weight of knowing a painful truth and choosing to bury it. The silence had been their shield, but it had also been their cage. By hiding the past, they had hoped to protect the village, but that silence had allowed fear to fester and distrust to grow. The protagonist understood now. It wasn't just the elders' fear, it was everyone's fear, and only by facing it together had they found a way forward. The village had become a living reminder of what happens when secrets are allowed to linger. Parents told their children of the time when the crying rock was feared, not revered. They spoke of the days when villagers looked away from their own history rather than confront it. "When you hear a sound that unsettles you," one mother told her son, "don't run from it. Ask what it means. Speak about it. That's how we learned. That's how we changed." The protagonist gathered the young villagers one evening, their voices calm but firm. "What we uncovered wasn't easy," they said, "but it was necessary. You need to remember this story so you don't repeat it." The children sat in a wide circle, their eyes bright and eager. Don't be afraid to question what you don't understand. And if you find something painful, don't hide it. Talk about it. That's how we heal. Reflecting on the journey, the protagonist felt a deep sense of relief. They had been terrified to confront the truth, but each step had shown them the strength of honesty. The courage to speak up, even when their voice shook, had changed everything. By challenging the silence, they had freed the village from its past. They had proven that the only way to move forward was through transparency, even when it hurt. The village was no longer the same, but that was a good thing. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now shared meals and laughter. The crying rock stood quietly among them, no longer a source of dread but a symbol of their resilience. The protagonist looked at the new generation and smiled. They knew that with each passing year, the village would grow stronger, bound not by secrets but by trust and unity,